Chapter 1. The Unearthed Composition. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the excavation site, its headlights cutting through the thick veil of Tuscan fog. Beyond the beams lay the skeletal remains of an abbey, crumbling stone arches swallowed by ivy, gutted walls bristling with dead vines like veins on a corpse. The air was damp and metallic, tinged with something Evelina Marchetti could only describe as old blood, a faint coppery note that lingered at the back of her throat. She stepped out of the car, pulling her coat tightly around her shoulders, the gravel crunching underfoot like bone fragments. It should have been beautiful. Tuscany in the autumn usually was, rolling hills, cypress trees, and the faint scent of wood smoke. But here, the world felt carved out of shadow. The abbey crouched in the dark like a predator. Two armed Foundation guards greeted her at the perimeter fence, their faces blank beneath black helmets. Their rifles weren't slung lazily, they were clutched tight, ready. One checked her badge twice before letting her through, muttering under his breath in a language Evelina couldn't catch. "Dr. Marchetti," said a clipped voice from behind her. She turned to find Dr. Harold Keene, the site's lead archaeologist, striding toward her. He was pale and jittery, his Foundation ID badge hanging askew, his shirt collar stained with sweat despite the cold. "We've been expecting you." His handshake was damp and trembling. His eyes flicked past her shoulder to the tree line, as though something might be watching. "I came as soon as I could," Evelina said, adjusting the strap of her satchel. Inside were her notebooks, magnifying glass, and a battered copy of Codices Perduti, the seminal text on lost medieval manuscripts. "The message you sent said you'd found something unprecedented." Keene's lips tightened. "You could call it that." He led her past rows of tents and floodlights toward the abbey's gaping nave. As they walked, Evelina noticed the subtle marks of hasty reinforcement: steel barricades welded into ancient stonework, motion sensors bristling from centuries-old masonry, and bright yellow warning signs staked into the earth every few meters. "Containment zone. Authorized personnel only." Inside the abbey, a square of flooring had been removed, revealing a yawning hole that exhaled damp, cold air. Rusty scaffolding led down into darkness. Evelina peered over the edge and felt her stomach tighten. Beneath the ruins lay a labyrinthine network of catacombs, their walls carved with worn Latin inscriptions and crude musical notations etched into stone by trembling hands. Keene noticed her staring. "Monastery catacombs. Late 12th century, maybe earlier. We thought it was just a crypt at first." His voice lowered. "Then we found it." They descended the scaffolding one careful rung at a time, their footsteps echoing off the damp stone. The smell intensified the deeper they went: stale earth, mildew, and that faint coppery tang again, stronger now, clinging to the walls like a hidden infection. At the bottom, a narrow tunnel stretched ahead, lit by flickering industrial lamps strung up like a nervous heartbeat. Foundation researchers in hazmat suits moved about, their boots crunching on shards of something Evelina realized wasn't stone, but dried, dark flakes. Old blood, ground to powder. "Is this—" she began, but Keene cut her off. "Just keep walking." They passed a small alcove where two guards were posted outside a sealed door. One of them sat on a crate, staring at nothing, his helmet off. His eyes were bloodshot and his lips moved silently, as though humming to himself. The other guard noticed Evelina looking and shifted his rifle nervously. Finally, they reached the chamber. It was small, circular, and low-ceilinged, carved from the living rock. The walls were painted with flaking frescoes of angels holding instruments, harps, lutes, violins, all of them depicted with red streaks flowing from their eyes. In the center stood a reinforced glass case, bathed in sterile light. Inside lay a manuscript, yellowed parchment inked with spidery black notes that writhed across the staff lines like living things. Evelina stepped closer, her breath catching. The composition was beautiful and terrible at once. a jagged lattice of melody and silence that seemed to claw at the eyes. There was something hungry about it, as if the notes were unfinished and reaching outward for more. In the upper right corner, smeared into the parchment, was a brownish-red handprint. She turned to Keene. "Is this?" He nodded grimly. SCP-012, designated a bad composition. First recovered in the mid-19th century, lost again during World War II, and now this. We sealed it as soon as we found it, but he hesitated, licking dry lips. "It's already taken some of us." A crash echoed from somewhere down the tunnel, a metal tray falling, perhaps, or something heavier. Evelina flinched. Keene didn't move. "What do you mean, taken?" she asked. Keene's jaw clenched. "Two agents slit their wrists with excavation tools trying to finish the piece. One of our researchers tried to copy the score. He gouged out his own eyes first." His voice was thin, like a string pulled too tight. "It wants to be complete. It uses them." Evelina stared at the manuscript again. This close she could swear she heard something, a faint, discordant humming, like a choir tuning instruments somewhere deep in the stone. The hairs on her neck stood up. And yet, beneath the dread, fascination took root. This was no ordinary artifact. This was history and horror bound together, something the world was never meant to see. She pressed a palm against the cold glass, leaning closer, eyes wide. The notes seemed to shimmer faintly, their shapes twisting, shifting, reaching. The humming grew louder. "Dr. Marchetti," Keene said sharply, pulling her back. His grip on her arm was stronger than she expected. "Don't look at it too long." She blinked, realizing her fingernails had dug into her own palm hard enough to draw blood. Somewhere in the catacombs, the humming swelled, just for an instant, into a single aching chord. And then it stopped. Chapter 2. Crimson Ink and Missing Fingers. The fluorescent lights in Site-43's medical wing flickered with a faint, irregular pulse, casting the hallway in a pale, sickly glow. Evelina Marchetti walked slowly, the soft click of her heels muted by the antiseptic hush of the corridor. The air smelled of bleach and iron, a scent she'd come to associate with the Foundation's containment facilities, cleanliness masking something rotten underneath. She paused at the end of the hallway, where two guards stood like black statues outside a reinforced steel door. Their rifles were cradled but not slack. The red access-restricted panel above the door blinked, accompanied by the faint hum of hidden machinery. "I'm here to see Agent Salvatore," she said, producing her temporary credentials. "We agreed yesterday." "Dr. Marchetti?" The taller of the guards spoke her name with no warmth. His mirrored visor reflected her pale, drawn face back at her. "You've been granted 15 minutes. No recording devices, no pens, no sharp objects. He's unstable." "I understand." She didn't, not fully, but she nodded anyway. The door hissed as it opened, sliding aside with a slow hydraulic groan. The smell hit her first, stale sweat, iodine, and something coppery and faintly sweet. Blood. Her stomach tightened as she stepped inside. The room was bare concrete, lit by a single flickering strip light. In the center sat a man hunched on a cot, his bare feet curled against the cold floor. His hands, or what remained of them, were bound loosely in white bandages. Dried crimson seeped through in dark constellations. On the walls, scratched with fingernails and streaks of red, was music. Hundreds of jagged staff lines and notes scrawled like desperate prayers. Some of the markings were smeared as though he had dragged his hands across them mid-write. Agent Salvatore had been tall once. Evelina could see it in the slope of his shoulders, the long limbs now drawn inward like a spider folding itself. His hair was matted and streaked with gray, despite his youth. His lips moved constantly, but no sound came. Evelina approached slowly, every step loud in the small room. "Agent Salvatore?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. He was scratching at the wall with the jagged edge of a broken fingernail, dragging it down the concrete to leave a faint pink smear. Blood welled from the torn cuticle, dripping onto the floor in tiny, steady drops. He worked with a frantic, unbroken rhythm, as if guided by some internal metronome she could not hear. "I'm Dr. Evelina Marchetti," she tried again. "I study musical manuscripts. I'm here to understand what happened to you." This time his head twitched, just slightly, as if the words had brushed against something inside him. His eyes were sunken, ringed with black, but when they turned toward her they were startlingly clear, gray and sharp, and full of something like hunger. He raised his hands as though to show her something. 4 fingers were gone from his left hand, 3 from his right. The stumps were neatly healed, yet ragged at the edges, as though bitten off rather than surgically removed. Her breath caught. "You—" She had to stop, swallow. "You tried to complete the music?" Salvatore's mouth opened soundlessly. His tongue was dark, bruised, and cracked. He tapped his remaining thumb against the bandages, then gestured to the wall. She followed his movement. Amid the chaos of scrawls, one section stood out, a set of staff lines written in blood so fresh it glistened wetly under the fluorescent light. The notes were jagged, uneven, and yet beautiful. Like a scream transcribed. He lurched suddenly from the cot, crossing the small space between them faster than she expected, his remaining fingers clamped on her sleeve. His touch was damp and trembling, smearing her coat with red. He pointed at her satchel, his lips forming shapes she almost understood. "You heard it?" She stepped back slightly, heart thudding. "No, I haven't heard it, only seen it." His eyes widened with something between terror and ecstasy. He pressed his palm hard against the wall, smearing blood over the notes, and began dragging his nail again, frantic, desperate. Evelina realized he was trying to write more, the next measure, the next note, but he had no fingers left to do it properly. The sound of nail against concrete was like an insect's chittering, rising and falling with his rapid breaths. "Salvatore, stop," she said gently. "You're hurting yourself." He turned on her then, his chest heaving. The tendons in his neck stood out like cords. For an instant she saw something in his face. Recognition, maybe, or pity. He lifted his bloodied hand and, with a trembling motion, traced a single staff line in the air between them. Then he pressed it to his lips. Evelina's stomach turned cold. It was not a gesture of music. It was a plea, or a warning. The door clanged open behind her. The guards stormed in, rifles raised but not fired. One grabbed Salvatore by the shoulders, dragging him back to the cot. He didn't fight, only sat there, trembling. Eyes fixed on her, as though she were the only real thing left in his world. "Time's up, Doctor," the taller guard said. "Out." She opened her mouth to protest, but the look in Salvatore's eyes silenced her. He was mouthing something again, the words formed slowly, grotesquely deliberate, like a silent aria. "Don't look at it. Don't look at it too long." They shut the door behind her with a hollow metallic clang. In the hallway, Evelina pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammering like a drum. She could still smell the blood on her sleeve, still see those frenzied red notes on the cell wall burned into her mind's eye. By the time she returned to her temporary quarters, her hands were trembling. She washed her coat 3 times, but faint stains lingered like ghosts. That night, she dreamed of music she had never heard, a discordant, aching symphony written in crimson ink across the walls of her mind. And when she woke, she realized she'd been humming it in her sleep. Chapter 3. The Forbidden Vault. The night hung heavy over Site 43 like a leaden shroud. The Foundation complex, usually alive with the low thrum of generators and the shuffle of security patrols, had entered its nocturnal lull. Beyond the barbed wire fences, the Tuscan hills were nothing but black undulations under a sickle moon. Inside, the sterile hallways stretched endlessly, the white walls gleaming faintly under the dimmed night cycle lights. Evelina had been awake for hours, pacing her quarters like a caged animal. Salvatore's blood-scrawled notes haunted her. They'd kept her out of SCP-012's chambers since the interview, citing psychological contamination and access restrictions, but Evelina's mind would not stop circling the forbidden manuscript like a vulture. She'd spent her career studying fragments of lost operas and marginalia of doomed composers, men and women who had gone mad chasing perfection. But this was different. This was not human genius. This was something other. And she needed to see it again. Her heart hammered as she slipped the stolen keycard from her coat pocket. She'd lifted it from Keene's desk earlier that evening while he'd been distracted with a video conference. The card was cold and weighty, its black stripe like a line of dried ink. She moved through the dim corridors barefoot, her shoes tucked under her arm to muffle sound. Foundation signs and warning placards slid past her like silent judges. Containment zone, level 4 clearance required. Memetic hazard ahead. No unauthorized access. At the end of the hallway lay a reinforced door sealed with a digital keypad. The air here felt different, denser, colder. A faint vibration thrummed through the floor like the distant resonance of an unseen instrument. She swiped the card. The red light blinked, then turned green with a soft click. The door opened slowly, sighing as though it disapproved. The stairwell beyond was narrow and steep, spiraling downward like the throat of some stone beast. The deeper Evelina descended, the colder it became. Moisture beaded on the concrete walls, slick under her palm. The smell was the same one that had haunted her since the excavation, damp earth and the faintest edge of copper, blood left to dry, then bloom again in the humidity. She reached the bottom and found herself in a corridor unlike any she'd seen in the facility. The walls were older here, cut directly into bedrock rather than poured concrete. Embedded security lights flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to sway like tattered banners. Her own breathing echoed, too loud. At the corridor's end loomed another door, thicker than the last, sealed with both biometric locks and a heavy wheel mechanism like a bank vault. Her stolen card worked again, though the panel hesitated before granting her access. The wheel turned with a groan. As the door opened, a gust of air rolled out, cold, dry, and carrying with it a whisper of sound. Not a draft, not the creak of the hinges. A sound. A faint, dissonant hum like the first tentative strokes of a bow against violin strings. The vault was circular and vast, its walls lined with black acoustic paneling and heavy chains bolted into the floor. Overhead, the ceiling formed a dome of ancient brickwork, blackened by centuries. In the center stood a single pedestal of polished steel. Upon it, sealed in a glass case reinforced with tungsten bars, lay the manuscript. SCP-012. Evelina's throat went dry. Even from the doorway, the parchment seemed to radiate a presence. The notes were not static ink, but alive, quivering faintly on their staff lines like insects under a magnifying glass. The script was not any she had studied. No Latin notation, no Baroque symbology, nothing from Gregorian or Byzantine tradition. It was alien, jagged, yet seductive. It felt less like written music, and more like something etched directly into the air. She stepped closer, her bare feet soundless on the smooth floor. The whispers grew louder with every step, threading between the beats of her heart. Not voices exactly, but the impression of voices, half-formed syllables. A sighing chorus just beyond comprehension. Her pulse slowed to match their rhythm, each beat echoing like a drum in her skull. She pressed her hands against the glass. It was icy under her fingertips. Up close, she saw that the parchment was spattered with faded brown stains. Blood. Not dried ink. Blood. The edges of the sheet curled inward as if it were breathing. Her eyes traced the incomplete measures. Whole passages stopped mid-phrase, lines breaking off like cliff edges. The silence between the notes seemed louder than the notes themselves, an aching absence begging to be filled. And somewhere in that silence, she thought she heard a voice whispering in Italian. Finissilo. Finish it. Complete it. Evelina's breath fogged the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed, mouth slightly open. The longer she looked, the more her reflection seemed to ripple, her eyes darkening, her lips twisting into a faint, blood-stained smile that wasn't hers. The whispers were clearer now. She could make out fragments of melody, sharp, discordant intervals that shouldn't exist in human music but did here, perfectly. The sound threaded through her veins like a drug. Her pulse quickened again, and she realized she was swaying, her body rocking in time to the inaudible music. She lifted her hand from the glass and touched her face. Her nose was bleeding, a thin line of red running over her lip, unnoticed until now. Her fingertips trembled, slick with it. Somewhere behind her, a metallic clang echoed down the corridor. Evelina spun, heart hammering. The door had closed. She was alone in the vault. When she turned back to SCP-012, the notes seemed different. Rearranged, perhaps, or maybe her eyes were failing. The staff lines appeared to stretch toward her, faint tendrils of ink creeping across the glass like cracks in ice. She blinked. They were still again. But the whispers had become a low, harmonious moan now, threading through the vault, vibrating in her ribs. She could swear she heard Salvatore's voice among them, soft and pleading. Her knees buckled slightly. She pressed her forehead to the glass. It was so cold, so beautiful. Just a little longer, she thought. Just a little closer. The whispers surged, a tide rising. Her heartbeat matched it perfectly, a metronome to madness. And then, silence. The glass under her palms pulsed once, faintly, like something alive breathing against her skin. Chapter 4. Measures of Madness. The days that followed Evelina's unauthorized visit to the vault blurred together like watercolors running down a page. Time itself seemed to shift its rhythm, hours compressing into heartbeats, seconds stretching into eternities, punctuated by a single, pulsing chord she could no longer tell was real. In the beginning, she tried to convince herself it was nothing more than exhaustion. The Foundation had buried her in endless psychological evaluations and debriefings, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. How long did you remain in the vault? Did you hear anything unusual? Did you touch the glass? Evelina answered them all mechanically, but inside she was humming. Always humming, discordant fragments stitched together from no known melody, no known time signature, something that lived in the spaces between. When she tried to write about it that first night, sitting cross-legged on the sterile cot of her quarters, the words wouldn't come. Her hand trembled above the page, pen hovering uselessly. Then, as if guided by an unseen conductor, she began to draw staff lines. Notes spilled from her pen, not chosen, but dragged from her, half-familiar shapes, jagged and fluid at once. Her handwriting had always been elegant and deliberate. Now it was manic, a fever graph of something clawing its way out of her. She stared at the page when she finished, a cold sweat slicking her back. This was not a transcription. This was something new, yet also impossibly old, as though she had merely uncovered it. She tried to scratch it out, but found herself clutching the pen until her knuckles went white, unable to stop. The next morning, she awoke to find the sheet streaked with blood. Her fingertips were raw, the skin at the cuticles split and weeping. She must have been writing in her sleep. Her journal lay open on the desk, filled with pages upon pages of notations scrawled in crimson. Not ink, blood. The staff lines were shaky but precise, as though something inside her had found its rhythm. The surveillance began quietly. She noticed first in the cafeteria, 2 guards sitting a table over, never eating, their visored faces turned just slightly toward her. Then the new camera mounted in the hallway outside her quarters, the faint click of its lens when she moved. She told herself it was protocol, but the paranoia festered. Even in her own room she felt watched. The walls seemed to hum faintly with the same chord she heard in her skull, as if the entire facility were resonating with her private dissonance. She started sending letters to her husband, Lorenzo. At first they were normal attempts at reassurance. The work here is fascinating. I'll be home soon. But then the staff lines crept in between her words. A treble clef at the edge of a sentence. A cluster of notes replacing his name. By the 3rd letter, there were no words at all, just music. Jagged black notes like barbed wire sprawling across the paper, written in an unsteady hand. The Foundation intercepted them, of course. But one got through, she knew, because he wrote back. His response was confused, frightened. "Evelina, are you all right? Why is there blood on this? What is this music?" She hadn't realized until she saw his words that she had written in her own blood again. She could remember sitting at her desk, pen in hand, but not the act itself. The humming in her head grew louder. At first it was only at night, lying awake in her cot, but soon it filled every waking moment. The notes climbed her spine like fingers, pressing against her skull from the inside. She caught herself humming under her breath, in the showers, in the mess hall during interviews. Other staff began to glance at her nervously, then avoid her altogether. Sometimes she thought she heard instruments joining in. The hiss of the air ducts became a flute, the rhythmic thump of boots in the hall, a drum. Even her own heartbeat felt like timpani under the growing symphony. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the music stayed, vibrating through her bones. Her fingertips worsened. By the end of the week, the skin there had turned paper-thin, bleeding at the slightest touch. Bandages stained red within hours. Still she wrote, unable to stop. Her journal became a grimoire of notation, every page filled with something she couldn't read, but somehow understood. She woke one night to find she'd scratched a staff line into the wall with her own nails, faint rivulets of blood dripping from the grooves. Dr. Keene came to see her once. His face was ashen, his voice taut. "Evelina," he said quietly, "they're talking about transferring you to a higher security site. Psychological quarantine." He glanced at her bandaged fingers and the journal on her desk. "You have to stop. Whatever it's doing to you, it's not research anymore." She laughed. The sound startled them both. It came out high and thin, not entirely hers, like the last harmonic of a dying note. "Stop?" she asked. "It's not me. It's the music." "It's already written. I'm just the paper." Keene left without answering. That night, Evelina dreamed of the manuscript. She saw herself inside the vault, the glass gone, the parchment pulsing like a living heart. The notes were tendrils now, reaching for her. They wrapped around her fingers, burrowing under her skin like black veins. She woke to find herself standing at her desk, pen in hand, scribbling frantically on a fresh sheet of paper. Blood pooled under her palm, dripping onto the floor. Her last letter to Lorenzo before they cut off her contact was no letter at all. A single page, stained brown, covered in dense musical notation that looped back on itself like a spiral, a melody without end. In the corner, in her own hand but in a script she didn't recognize, were 2 words: Finicilo. Completa. Finish it. Complete it. When the guards came the next morning to install a second camera in her quarters, they found her sitting at the desk, humming softly. Her fingers were bandaged to the knuckles. The journal lay open before her, its pages a sea of red and black. She didn't look up as they entered. Outside, in the sterile corridor, they filed their report in silence. Subject displays signs of progressive mimetic contamination. Surveillance recommended. Escalation pending. Inside, Evelina pressed her trembling hands to the paper and listened as the music swelled. Chapter 5. The Choir of the Damned. When the orderlies burst into Evelina's quarters just after 4 a.m., they found her standing motionless in front of the mirror, barefoot, drenched in sweat, and humming. Her nightgown was soaked with blood, clinging to her body like a second skin. Her arms were covered in crimson lines, staff lines. 5 parallel cuts ran from the crook of each elbow down to her wrists, drawn with terrifying precision. The wounds weren't superficial. Skin had been flayed in places to keep the lines straight, uniform, clean, as if her flesh were a page to be written on. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't cried. She just stood there, humming a dissonant motif that clawed at the air like broken fingers on piano keys. Her eyes met the reflections, and for a moment, she did not recognize herself. The orderlies restrained her gently, cautiously, as if worried touching her might cause something to unravel. Blood soaked through the sterile white gloves of one handler. Another gasped aloud when they noticed the back of her neck. Carved into the skin was a swirling treble clef, burned there as if seared with a branding iron. She hadn't done it with a knife. It had simply appeared. They sedated her. She woke hours later, wrists bandaged, body heavy with pharmaceuticals. The room was unfamiliar, clean, padded, utterly silent. No hum of air ducts, no distant footsteps, no music. But in her head, the symphony never stopped. The next morning, she was summoned to a psychological evaluation. 2 Foundation psychologists waited in a glass-walled observation chamber. Both wore lab coats, too crisp, expressions too carefully neutral. The woman, Dr. Lentz, spoke first. "Dr. Marchetti," she began gently, "do you know why you're here?" Evelina stared at her hands. The bandages were tight, white, too clean. She imagined tearing them off, revealing the music underneath. "Because I'm getting too close." Lentz exchanged a glance with her colleague. "You were found self-harming," the man said flatly. "Staff lines carved into your arms. Your skin is not a notebook, Dr. Marchetti. This is not normal behavior." Evelina's eyes flicked up. "Normal doesn't apply here. Not to this. SCP-012 isn't just a document. It's an organism. It grows. It consumes. It wants to be finished, and it uses us to do it. Over a dozen personnel have been affected," Lentz said carefully. 9 mutilations, 4 fatalities, all from exposure or prolonged study. Agent Salvatore is permanently catatonic. Others have torn their eyes out, severed tendons, bled themselves dry to finish that damned song. "You're next, unless we stop this." Evelina leaned forward, voice low. "What if I told you I understand it?" They went still. "Not entirely," she said, "but enough. The notation, it's not human. The time signatures bend, the intervals shift. It's a language, not just music, like Gregorian chant, mated with something cosmic, alien. You're showing advanced signs of mimetic contamination," Lentz said coldly. "This isn't music, it's a cognitive hazard. You're compromised." "I'm not," Evelina snapped. "Not yet. I still know the difference between listening and obeying. That's more than the others had." Silence settled over the room like a shroud. "You're bleeding out on paper, Dr. Marchetti," said the male psychologist. "It's using your body like a quill." "I'm giving it what it wants," she said, smiling faintly. But not all of it, not yet. That's why I'm still here. Later that day, they moved her into medical quarantine. A sterile observation suite with one desk, one chair, a cot, and a camera tucked in the corner behind reinforced glass. They let her have her journal. No pens, no ink, only a wax stylus and pre-printed sheets of blank musical staff lines. She took them gladly, and that night when the staff reviewed her pages, they found the stylus had been sharpened to a point against the edge of the desk, and the notation was no longer just music. It was a map, a conceptual topology, overlapping scores designed for instruments that didn't exist, for chords that couldn't be heard by human ears, for choirs that had no mouths. The following morning, Keene came to see her. His eyes were ringed with exhaustion. "You made your case," he said. "They're letting you continue, under supervision." She looked up from her sheet, where she was sketching a series of polyphonic phrases that intersected like veins. "I told you, I can translate it." He hesitated. "You should know something. We've analyzed the pattern of the mutilations. The more people try to complete it, the more synchronized the incidents become. We had 3 personnel last week, on different continents. They all drew the same 4 measures, same bleeding, same tempo." Evelina's mouth went dry. "They're not just completing it independently," Keene whispered. "They're becoming the same instrument." The phrase chilled her more than any warning, because deep down, she already suspected it. The composition wasn't written for solo. It was a chorus, a choir, one without voices, one that bled instead of sang. The choir of the damned. That night, Evelina dreamed again, not of the manuscript, but of a concert hall carved from bone, filled with shadowy figures slumped over strange skeletal instruments. The music they played was wrong, beautiful but sharp, jagged, made of shrieks and sobs and the sound of nails across a chalkboard. Their conductor stood at the front, faceless, his baton a sharpened shard of glass. When she awoke, she was humming the overture perfectly, and her bandages were soaked red. Chapter 6. Resonance. The days in quarantine became indistinguishable. Only the music marked time now. The sterile cell where Evelina sat no longer felt like a room. It was a chamber, a resonant box. Every surface vibrated faintly with the score that had taken root inside her skull. The hum of fluorescent lights became a droning pedal tone, the hiss of the ventilation system a ghostly flute. Even the pulse in her wrists had developed a syncopation that no doctor could explain. Her skin had grown pale, translucent, the veins beneath her wrists like faint black staff lines. Every night she bled from her fingertips, and every morning the Foundation's medics rewrapped them. She no longer looked at them, she just kept writing. But she wasn't writing anymore, not really. She was transcribing. She wasn't the author, she was the medium. The music was speaking. She had started hearing it in words now, barely, at the edge of sense. Not Italian, not Latin. Some older tongue, carried on vibrating chords. It wasn't just melody. It was instruction, phrases like commands, but also like promises, filling her head in careful, dissonant intervals. When she tried to sleep, the manuscript filled her dreams. Not just the parchment, but something beyond it. A sprawling cosmic score that extended into infinity, written in blood and void. She saw herself standing on a cliff of quivering flesh, while below, a great orchestra writhed in the dark, playing with their hands flayed open, the bowstrings of their instruments drawn from their own veins. She would wake up gasping and laughing at the same time, clutching her temples, hearing echoes of applause that no one else heard. The Foundation noticed. They increased her surveillance, doubled the guards at her door. Psychologists came daily, speaking to her through bulletproof glass, but their words were muted under the roaring symphony in her head. Sometimes their mouths moved out of sync, as if the score were rewriting the tempo of reality. And then Evelina had an idea. They would never let her near SCP-012 again. But she had been near it, long enough to memorize swaths of its jagged notation. In her journal, she had pieced together the first complete movement. If she couldn't hold the manuscript itself, she could make it live another way. They had given her a laptop for research. Its hard drive was scrubbed of external access, but it still had basic music software for transcription. A toy compared to real orchestration programs, but enough. Evelina entered the notes by hand, bar by bar, each jagged measure translated into digital sound. She worked feverishly, her bandaged fingers smearing faint spots of blood on the keys. The playback function blinked. Ready, she pressed it. The sound that came out of the laptop speakers was not human music. It was a rasping, shuddering howl, rendered as strings and winds, underpinned by a drumbeat like a dying heart. Chords bent upward into intervals no instrument should sustain, yet the software obeyed anyway, stretching itself beyond its programming. Evelina felt her vision double. The walls of her room pulsed in and out like lungs. Her skin prickled. But she was smiling. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, that's it." From the hall, she heard a guard stumble. The laptop speakers were low, but the sound seeped through the walls like gas. Someone screamed, a short, sharp cry that cut off instantly. She turned and saw, through the reinforced glass, one of the two guards clawing at his own face. His partner tried to stop him, but collapsed, convulsing, blood dribbling from his nose. Evelina stood transfixed, watching the music take them. It moved like a virus, like resonance. It wasn't just sound. It was an idea, vibrating the brain itself. The psychologist monitoring her burst into the corridor, shouting for the guards to shut the playback off. She saw him clamp his hands to his ears, eyes wide with terror. He dropped to his knees, retching. Blood splashed the white tile like ink. Evelina slowly reached forward and stopped the playback. Her lips curled up furiously. Her lips curled up. The corridor fell silent, except for labored breathing and muffled sobs. One guard lay still. The other sat slumped against the wall, trembling, his helmet torn away, eyes staring blankly at nothing. Within seconds, alarms blared. Red strobes flashed across the facility. The door to her cell sealed itself with a hiss of hydraulics, locking her inside. "Containment breach. Mimetic event," scrolled across the emergency screens. Evelina backed away from the laptop, but she couldn't stop smiling. Her whole body trembled with exhilaration. She had proven it. The music was alive. It wasn't just a composition. It was an organism, an intelligence. It had used her to propagate itself. And now it had found a way to spread without the parchment. She pressed her bandaged hands against her temples, laughing softly as the alarms wailed. The symphony in her head was deafening now, filling every nerve. She could feel the pulse of the entire facility in time with the rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, someone screamed again, longer this time, a sound like a violin string drawn across bone. "Do you hear it?" Evelina whispered to no one. "It's almost complete." The lights flickered. The humming deepened. And as the lockdown sealed the complex, the music swelled into a living, breathing crescendo. Chapter 7. Red Symphony. The days after the lockdown blurred into a fever. Evelina no longer remembered when she last slept. Her nights were just longer stretches of the same waking trance. The Foundation had taken her laptop, her stylus, every object she might use to write. But that didn't matter anymore. She had no need for tools now. The music had given her its own. Her body, her hands trembled constantly, fingers bandaged from the last session's wounds. But at night the bandages unraveled. Her nails tore through them as if guided by something stronger than will. She would wake to find her fingertips split to the quick, skin peeled back like paper. Yet no pain. until she stopped writing. The staff had posted 2 guards outside her cell at all times. She could feel their presence in the vibrations of the floor, boots shifting uneasily, rifles clinking softly. She knew they whispered about her, knew they were afraid. But what they didn't know, what Evelina was just beginning to realize, was that the music liked it this way. It didn't want ink anymore, it wanted her. On the 3rd night after the lockdown, Evelina awoke in darkness to find herself kneeling in the center of her room. Around her lay dozens of sheets of Foundation-issue paper, all filled edge to edge with blood-red notation. Her hands were slicked to the wrists, sticky and metallic-smelling. Her tongue tasted copper. She blinked at the pages. They weren't random. They were precise, legible. The first complete movement of the score was there, written perfectly, impossibly, in her own hand. Even passages she had never seen in SCP-012's vault appeared here, whole, as if she were transcribing from a source no one else could access. The floor beneath the papers was speckled with droplets, smears where her elbows had rested. She had no memory of writing any of it. Her bandaged fingers pulsed with heat. Blood seeped through the fabric in delicate tendrils dripping onto the floor. She realized she had scrawled stab lines onto her own forearms again, cutting shallow grooves into the skin, deeper this time, each wound perfectly parallel. When she stood, the room swam. The walls vibrated faintly with a low note, almost a growl, like the facility itself was part of the orchestra now. The guards found her at dawn. She was sprawled on the floor, surrounded by the pages, her hair matted to her face with sweat. Her breath came in shallow, ragged pulls. Her lips moved, humming a motif that made the younger guard flinch and cross himself. The air smelled like iron and ammonia, a metallic sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. "Jesus Christ," the older guard muttered, stepping over the papers. "Call medical, now." He bent to lift her and froze. The notation stared up at him from the pages, alien, jagged, but undeniably musical. It pulsed faintly under the fluorescent light, as though the blood were still fresh. The younger guard swore under his breath. She's finished it. Or, look, it's more than before. The older man straightened, shaking his head. "That's not possible. Nobody's ever—" "Ever what?" the younger demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at Evelina's arms. Her skin was marked with so many staff lines, it resembled sheet music carved into flesh. Between the lines, fresh notation glistened faintly, written not with pen, but with her own blood-dipped fingertip. Medical arrived in a flurry of white coats and blue gloves. One tried to move the papers away from her body, but Evelina jerked away, clutching at them with surprising strength. Her eyes snapped open, gray and fever-bright. "No," she hissed. Her voice was raw, cracked from hours of humming. "Don't touch it." "Dr. Marchetti," one of the medics said carefully, "we're here to help you. You're bleeding badly." "I am writing," she said, and smiled, her teeth red with blood. The medic recoiled slightly. Behind them, Dr. Keene arrived, breathless, holding a clipboard. His eyes swept over the scene, the pages, the blood, Evelina's trembling body, and went wide. This shouldn't be happening," he muttered. "The manuscript has never expanded like this without a fatality." "What do you mean?" one guard asked. Keene didn't answer immediately. He crouched and picked up one of the sheets, his gloved hands shaking. The notation was dense, intricate, impossible. It continued passages from the original SCP-012, but branched into new movements, as though the score had grown a second limb. "It's using her," he whispered. "She's not just completing it. She's feeding it, translating it into something it's never been before." Evelina laughed softly, the sound more like a gasp. "I'm not feeding it," she murmured. "It's feeding me." Blood trickled from her nose, down her chin, dripping onto the nearest sheet like ink from a quill. Her eyes rolled back briefly, and her fingers twitched, as though playing invisible keys. Keen backed away. "We need to move her. Now. Isolation. This is beyond mimetic contamination." But no one moved. The room vibrated faintly with a sound they couldn't hear but could feel, a low resonance, like the echo of a cathedral bell struck deep underground. One guard's nose began to bleed. Another dropped his radio, which emitted a single distorted chord before going silent. Evelina's humming deepened. She looked at Keen and smiled again, but this time there was nothing human in it. "It's almost finished," she said softly. "Can't you hear it?" And for a moment they could. Not with their ears, but with their bones, the faint rise of strings, the swell of unseen voices, a red symphony played on instruments of flesh and iron. Keen stumbled back, eyes wide. Shut it down. Shut it all down. But the music in the room was already louder than the alarms that began to wail seconds later. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Catacombs. They came for her at night. They always did. 2 guards in black body armor entered her quarantine cell without a word. No explanation, no escorting doctors, no observers behind glass. Just 2 rifles and a silent syringe. The taller one held it up before her eyes like a final blessing. Clear fluid, no label, lethal dose. Evelina didn't fight. She only smiled, blood drying at the corners of her mouth, and whispered, "You're too late. The finale has already begun." The shorter guard hesitated. "Jesus," he muttered. "She knows?" The taller one didn't flinch. It doesn't matter. But it did. When the lights died in the corridor seconds later, plunging the wing into complete, howling darkness, the guards hesitated. And in that hesitation, Evelina moved. Not with brute force or speed, but with a kind of inevitability, as if she were a note in a phrase finally resolving. She drove her forehead into the taller man's nose with a sickening crunch. He staggered, dropped the syringe. The shorter one lifted his rifle, but Evelina was already moving, grasping for the shard of broken ceramic from the previous night's food tray. She buried it into his thigh. He screamed, collapsing. By the time emergency lights flickered on in pulsing red, she was gone. The corridor echoed with alarms and boots, but Evelina had known the Foundation's underbelly long enough to know its weaknesses. She didn't need clearance when every hallway throbbed with the same cadence she had come to live by. She moved with purpose, barefoot and bleeding, trailing dark footprints through polished linoleum, ducking into maintenance shafts and utility tunnels. The deeper she went, the louder the humming became, not in the air, but inside her. The score wasn't done. Not yet. It was waiting in the catacombs. By the time she reached the excavation site, the storm had broken. Rain lashed the broken stones of the ruined abbey, and the sky was a mass of writhing gray, lit now and then by veins of lightning that cracked the world open for a second at a time. The entrance to the dig lay where it always had, in the old nave, beneath the shattered altar, where the dead monks once prayed. Evelina tore open the hatch and descended into the earth. The air grew colder with each step. Mold and rot mingled with the scent of dried blood and something older, an ancient wrongness that had long ago steeped into the stones. The catacombs were waiting. Her footfalls echoed off the narrow walls. The torches had been extinguished, but she didn't need them anymore. She could see in rhythm now, shapes and corridors revealing themselves in pulses, like a living strobe that only she could feel. The stone beneath her feet felt like bone. The corridors wept. She passed the sealed vault. SCP-012 still lay inside, but the glass had cracked. Its inked lines pressed against the barrier like veins searching for skin. She ignored it. It was no longer the source. The music had gone deeper. Beneath the Foundation's reach, beneath reason. She followed it down into the older tunnels, beyond the mapped areas, past rusted gates and skeletal remains in shattered alcoves. Monastic bones lay jumbled under centuries of dust, mouths agape in eternal agony. Some still held rusted instruments in their hands, wooden flutes rotted through, harp frames snapped. One had driven a broken tuning fork through his eye. But deeper still, beyond the ossuaries, she found it, a hidden chamber carved in perfect acoustics. It had no door, only a narrow crawl space between two collapsed pillars. She squeezed through, panting, arms scraped raw, and emerged into darkness so thick it had weight. She struck a match. Its flickering flame revealed a chamber lined with old stone columns, unlike the rest of the catacombs. These had been shaped, designed. They rose like organ pipes into the ceiling, and between them were pedestals. On each pedestal, an instrument. But these were not made of wood or brass. One was a cello strung with tendon, another a flute of polished femur. A drum made from a human rib cage, its skin still faintly warm to the touch. She had found them, the instrumental remains. The monks had not just composed. They had been built into the music. Choir of the damned, now perfectly silent, waiting for the conductor to return. And she had. She fell to her knees, blood pooling beneath her, and wept. Not in grief, in awe. Behind her, the sound of boots clattered down the corridors. The retrieval team arrived in a wave of noise and flashlight beams. 6 men, full tactical gear. Orders were clear: retrieve or neutralize. She was too far gone. A vector for propagation. An SCP herself now. The team entered the narrow crawl space one by one, weapons drawn. They emerged into the chamber like intruders at a funeral. Their radios began to emit static immediately, low at first, then shrill. Blood dripped from their ears. Flashlights flickered. Then the music began. Not from a speaker, not from SCP-012, from the air itself. A bow dragged across the tendon-stringed cello, a note so low it shook the breath from their lungs. The bone flute screamed a single, searing pitch. The rib drum beat once, twice, in time with their hearts. The first man collapsed, eyes wide, blood pouring from his nose. The second spun and fired blindly, his screams muffled by the rising crescendo. The music played itself, instruments vibrating without touch, controlled by something unseen, something that had waited centuries to be heard again. Evelina rose in the center, arms outstretched, her body drenched in crimson. The notes poured from her mouth like tongues of fire. She was not speaking. She was singing. The third man turned the gun on himself. The fourth vomited teeth. The fifth simply walked into the shadows and never returned. Only the sixth made it out. He emerged 3 hours later, barefoot, eyes wide and white, his voice lost. He collapsed into the mud at the surface, babbling a single phrase over and over again in a cracked whisper. "Would the hospital talk to me? Would the hospital be gen—" He finished it, she finished it, she finished it. Chapter 9. The Final Note. The Foundation scoured every inch of the catacombs for 3 days, but Evelina was gone. No body, no footprints, no blood trail. Nothing but the chamber of instruments, now silent and empty, as though it had never existed at all. Even the tendon strings, the bone flutes, the rib drums, they were gone. Only a residue remained on the stone pedestals, dark and tacky, like the ghost of dried blood. Dr. Keene stared at the empty chamber with hollow eyes, his hands shaking around a flashlight. He'd heard what happened to the retrieval team, the screams over comms, the gunfire, then silence. Only one man had come back, eyes glazed, whispering Evelina's name like a prayer. She's not gone. Keen muttered to himself. She's not gone? She's finished it. On the fourth day, a package arrived at Site 43. No courier, no return address, just a battered, blood-stained envelope left outside the perimeter fence. Inside was a single page of notation, dense, sprawling, precise, and a folded letter addressed to Lorenzo Marchetti. The letter was not written in words. It was a full orchestral score. The staff lines bled across the paper, the notes dark and glistening as though freshly inked. Whoever handled it reported a faint humming vibration, like holding a plucked string. The scent of copper rose from it in waves. The forensics technician who tried to photograph the page suffered a seizure within minutes, frothing at the mouth. When they wiped the foam away, they saw it was pink with blood. Foundation Command ordered the score sealed immediately under SCP protocol. But curiosity is a contagion, and in the depths of Site 43, curiosity always finds a host. 2 days later, a D-class musician, a failed concert violinist serving a life sentence, was caught sneaking into the chamber where the letter was kept. He'd bribed a guard with a contraband bottle of vodka. "Let me just hear it," he begged. "I've played everything. Bach, Paganini, Ligeti. Let me play this. I can do it justice." Against protocol, the guard relented. He thought it would be a joke, some broken melody scribbled in blood. They took him to an isolated testing chamber with reinforced glass. They gave him an old violin, a score stand, and a single page of Evelina's blood-soaked music. Cameras watched from the observation room. Dr. Keen, 2 psychologists, and 4 security personnel stood behind the glass. The guard who'd arranged the test was sweating, but grinning faintly, as though he'd get to see something no one else had. The D-class musician lifted the violin. His hands shook slightly, but when he drew the bow across the strings, the first note came out perfectly clear. A single, high, piercing sound like a scream turned into tone. Everyone in the observation room froze. The second note was lower, a growl in the gut. The third was impossible, 2 pitches at once, bending in opposite directions. The violin's wood creaked as though under pressure, yet the man's face went slack with bliss. He played on. By the 4th measure, the air in the chamber vibrated visibly. Dust lifted from the floor and hung suspended, trembling. The lights flickered. The musician's bow began to shred, strands of horsehair snapping one by one. Blood dripped from his nose. In the observation room, one of the psychologists collapsed, convulsing, blood streaming from her ears. The others stumbled back, clutching their heads, their teeth grinding audibly. "Shut it off!" Keen roared, pounding the glass. "Shut it down!" But the music didn't come from speakers. It was inside them. The D-class musician smiled, blood trickling from his eyes like tears. His left hand's fingers split at the tips as he pressed them against the strings, red soaking the fingerboard. His bow was nothing but splinters now. Yet the sound continued, drawn by something beyond the instrument itself. In the observation room, 2 guards dropped to their knees, vomiting a thin, pinkish slurry. One clawed at his throat until his nails came away bloody. The security cameras flickered and died. By the 7th measure, the music had become a wall of sound, voices screaming in harmony, instruments crying out in a pitch that felt like bone splintering. The glass between the rooms began to crack in spider-web patterns. The D-class musician's head snapped back. His jaw opened wider than it should, teeth shattering as blood sprayed from his mouth. Yet his hands kept moving. Keen thought he saw other hands layered over his, pale, spectral fingers guiding his bow. Then the glass shattered. The sound hit them like a wave. Keen dropped, clutching his stomach as if stabbed, bile and blood flooding his mouth. A guard shot himself in the head to make it stop. Another ripped out his own earpiece and drove it into his eye. And through it all, the musician played. Until, at the final note, the violin exploded into splinters. He collapsed, his body a slack marionette, mouth still open in a silent scream. The sound stopped. Silence hung in the chamber like a suffocating weight. The survivors lay sprawled, trembling, blood dripping from noses, ears, and eyes. The foundation moved fast. The chamber was sealed. The skull was burned, then sealed again in triple-layered containment under SCP-012 protocol. Access to SCP-012 itself was cut off entirely. All surviving witnesses were quarantined under memetic hazard procedures. Kane, his mouth still raw with blood, signed the order himself. "Lock it down," he croaked. "Level 5, nobody reads, nobody listens, not ever again." In his office later, staring at his trembling hands, he found a second page on his desk. He didn't remember putting it there. It was written in dark brown ink, drying slowly. A fragment of music. In the corner, in a hand he recognized as Evelina's, was a single phrase in Italian. Solo un movimento rimane. Only one movement remains. Chapter 10. A Composition in Flesh. It arrived on a rain-heavy morning, years after Evelina had vanished beneath the earth. The postman left it on the step without ringing. Lorenzo Marchetti opened the door to find a wooden crate, soaked dark with water and sealed with thick twine. No return address, only his name written in a hand he had not seen in years. A hand that once scribbled letters of love across parchment, then scrawled blood-streaked music he could not understand. The crate smelled faintly of copper and rot. He dragged it inside, fingers trembling. His apartment in Florence was dim and silent, heavy curtains blocking out the city beyond. He had not played his violin in years. He had not spoken Evelina's name aloud in even longer. He set the crate on the table and cut the twine. The smell intensified, warm and sweet and sickening, like old meat hidden under perfume. Inside, wrapped in black cloth, lay two things: a violin and a skull. He reached for the violin first. Its surface was smooth, polished, pale as ivory, yet veined faintly like bone. The scroll was carved into a screaming human face, its mouth agape as though eternally mid-note. The fingerboard was etched with delicate, spiraling staff lines. He realized with a twist of nausea that the strings were not gut or synthetic. They were strands of something still faintly pink, still faintly moist. He set it down quickly, heart hammering. Then he unfolded the score. The title bled across the top in a dark brown script. Final movement in red. Evelina's handwriting. The notes were denser than anything he had seen, layers upon layers of music stacked like organs in a body, clefts curling like tendrils. The paper was stiff, almost leathery, stained with faint, irregular patterns. He realized with dawning horror that it wasn't paper at all. It was skin. He dropped it, stumbling back. The score landed on the table with a wet sound, curling slightly at the edges. Yet even as revulsion rose in his throat, something else began, an itch behind his eyes, a faint hum in his ears. Music. Soft at first. Just a single note, impossibly clear, hanging in the air. He turned, scanning the room. The television was off, the radio unplugged, yet the note persisted, as if coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. He stared at the score. The notes shifted faintly on the skin, as though writhing. His hands moved on their own, reaching for the violin. The instrument was cold in his grip, but it warmed quickly, pulsing faintly, like a living thing. He raised it to his shoulder, fingers finding the strings, bow poised. His heart raced as the hum grew louder, swelling into a chord. He drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged was not a violin sound. It was a scream-made music, low and guttural, then high and glass-sharp, harmonics splitting like teeth, breaking. Lorenzo gasped. tears springing to his eyes. The apartment around him seemed to dim, its colors bleeding away, leaving only the music. He played another note. Another. The score guided him. He didn't need to read it. His fingers simply knew where to go. Blood welled from his fingertips, dripping onto the fingerboard. But he didn't stop. The sound grew larger, filling not just the room, but his mind, his bones. It was her voice, Evelina's, whispering through the music. Finish it. Play it. Become it. He laughed and sobbed at once. His bow hand trembled violently as a third voice joined the music, then a fourth, then dozens, an entire orchestra swelling out of nothing. He heard drums like heartbeats, cellos groaning like the ocean's depths, a choir singing wordless agony. His nose burst, blood streaming down his chin. Still he played. The neighbors found him hours later. He was on his knees in the center of the apartment, the violin still clutched to his chest. His eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling, pupils blown wide. Blood covered his shirt, dripping from his ears, staining the rug in red arcs where his bow had scraped wildly across the strings. The score lay open before him, glistening. And even though the apartment was silent, no violin, no voice, those who stepped inside swore they heard something faint. A distant, echoing symphony. By the time Foundation agents arrived, the violin had vanished. So had the score. But reports began trickling in from across Europe, small packages arriving at homes, churches, music schools, instruments carved from bone, fragments of notation on flesh. The Foundation classified it immediately. SCP-5634, final movement in red. Mimetic hazard. Self-replicating anomaly. Unconfirmed origin. Suspected continuation of SCP-012 event chain. Witnesses described a common phenomenon. Only the recipient could hear the music. To everyone else, silence. But those who heard it invariably began to hum, then write, then bleed. Some carved staff lines into their arms. Some flayed their fingertips raw trying to play instruments that weren't there. Within weeks, 3 orchestras across the continent had spontaneously collapsed mid-performance, vomiting blood, eyes rolling back as they writhed on stage. Emergency broadcasts were cut short by distorted chords. Even Foundation containment alarms began triggering, with notes instead of sirens. Somewhere inside the chaos, Foundation researchers realized the truth. This was no longer Evelina's work. It was the composition itself, alive, growing, replicating. A new anomaly had been born, not on paper, not in sound, but in flesh. And somewhere out there, beneath the noise and panic, a single violin played on, unseen, as the final movement in red spread across the world like a hymn of blood.